we can. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Stephanie to talk about this fabulous piece that she shared with us about unusual encounters. And, you know, there's topical things that are directly relevant to the moment we're living through. You know, we've been talking about bats and whether or not there's a link between SARS-CoV-2 and bats. And, you know, a couple of weeks ago, we had a bat ecologist on here who emphatically said something that Scott Gilbert reports in this article. You know, 2 weeks ago, we heard that the version of the bat virus that has been linked to the SARS-CoV-2 probably wouldn't infect humans. But here we have a different story about bats and these unusual encounters that might get us to think about multi-species ethics in a different sort of way. I think there's, in addition to asking us to think about endangered animals that have been seen in the current pandemic as, you know, sort of specters of terror or specters of contagion, to sort of get us to empathize, I think, in a new way because of shared lived experience. I think, you know, from the moment when you wrote this to now, there's a whole different you know, possibilities of empathy and relating. But I think what you're doing really well here, and I think it's, you know, some of the things that are going to travel from this essay to all sorts of other multi-species contact zones, is thinking about heterogeneity and difference and complexity and a supple notion of things that might push past any kind of simple reading of process philosophy, to think about ways that incompatibilities between activities of different kinds, such as the fungus at the center of the white nose disease. I'm not going to try to say it, but P. destructans, I'll say destructans, that looks easy, and little brown or little brown bats. You know, you're asking us to think about these emergent assemblages and in the context of, you know, symbiogenesis. And I think, you know, when I first encountered your rendering of symbiogenesis, I was struck by, like, oh, you know, we tend to celebrate the novel, like this is a logic of capital. But, you know, this piece is very carefully not doing that. It's not just simply celebrating the multiplicities of difference, like certain other theorists who you cite do. But you're thinking about these novel sites of emergence as an opportunity to theorize a new ethics. So that's what I really love about the piece. So I guess it's less of a question, but just sort of you know, a comment to open it up. But I'd love to hear, you know, how your thinking about these matters has changed living through a pandemic with bats as, you know, this figure of terror. But also, yeah, like how you see these ideas starting to travel into the unusual encounters that are proliferating in the current moment.
Thanks so much for that really kind introduction. Before I respond to your thoughtful comments, I just want to say that it's been such a pleasure to have joined this group. I learned a couple of months ago, thanks to Caitlin, that you exist, and I think the first meeting I joined, someone, I don't know, not even 5 minutes in, said, the virus is not a metaphor. And I knew immediately, like, I had come to the right place. So it's been just wonderful to think with all of you so far. This paper was actually my first ever publication. It began as a seminar paper that I wrote for a second year seminar entitled Romanticism and Radicalism when I was in graduate school. And I read it a little bit differently today, but I think the main themes are still, I'm still pretty happy with the way that I'm thinking about the main themes in the piece. I saw that there was a little bit of trouble accessing the links to the essays. So let me just really quickly, in case people didn't have a chance to read it, just explain that what I tried to do here was think about how the symbiotic view of life, what the implications were or likely to be for experience. And then to consider the ethical and political stakes of this revised to think of in terms of as more than human picture of experience. So experience as being more than human. So it's a pretty capacious notion of experience. It's not restricted to consciousness, but it also includes non-conscious visceral experiences of different kinds, and in particular, focusing on sort of semi-autonomous bodily experiences that are essentially aesthetic in character. I think biologists often refer to them in terms of receptors, but the way that I've come to think about them is that they are bodily aesthetic experiences in response to rates of sort of smell, taste. There are olfactory and taste receptors that have been identified within organs, the skin, internal organs. There's another place, but I'm forgetting where. And so these sort of non-conscious aesthetic experiences can be understood, I think, as more than human, as far as they are happening in relation, for example, I think maybe most obviously, right, to the Earth's rotation around the sun, to lunar phasings, and to these other sorts of large-scale Earth processes. So when Nagel, in his very wonderful and important essay, says that subjective experience is essentially connected to a single point of view, say, wait a minute, not so fast. There are perhaps many points of view. And what's really interesting is thinking about how these many points of view, right, sort of come together to create a single unified experience. And for me, at least, when I think about experience in this way, it's really not so easy to envision individuals as closed off from each other in sort of typical imaginings. Even events that take place across great distance may register on some level, even if only subliminally. And to me, this speaks quite forcefully in favor of a sort of process. Everything is located in very different ways in events, and this way of thinking about experience to me is helpful from a process perspective. So just, to put it simply, and I haven't already said this, but to me, when you attend to these multiple kinds of experience that intone consciousness but don't quite rise up into awareness, suggest a greater degree of mutual implication, human, non-human, human-human. And this, I think, holds promise for what Tom Van Doren and others have discussed in terms of multi-species ethics. More recently, I've been thinking in terms of coronavirus, and I just want to say at the outset that this is very, very preliminary. I have floated it to a couple of biologist friends, but I still have more work to do. But in this essay talking about white nose syndrome, little brown bats hibernate, and they are for the most part nocturnal. And yet when they are infected by this fungal pathogen, they have been observed flying in the middle of the day, in the middle of the winter. And they're flying to new caves, right, where the fungus then can sort of spread itself out some more. And there are multiple examples of this. The terms that are often used that I've come across are pathogen and host. Often the term hijacked is used, right? So a pathogen sort of hijacks something or other of the host, and then the host in effect does the pathogen's bidding. So that's right in the case of little brown bats, the bats are flying to new caves, and their social behavior, right, when they huddle together with other bats, allows the fungus to then spread out more easily. And so one thing I've been interested in considering from a political theoretical perspective, probably as a thought experiment, I'm not actually going to make this argument, but is there a way to think of the virus as an active participant in politics right now? So not just, right, as an object of action, and not quite as a subject, but maybe more akin to like an active force in what Foucault once referred to as subjectivation, right? So these processes through which subjects are continuously being formed and reformed. Because when I think about the two greatest obstructions to the virus, right, spreading itself out and replicating, it's masks and social distancing. So what kind of a political vocabulary would we need? Could we think of the virus as playing some part, obviously not the only part, but contributing in some way to the intensity of anti-mask and anti-social distancing measures? Is there a sense in which that would open up new kinds of questions, new kinds of political questions at the intersection of human and non-human life forms, specifically, right, not necessarily symbiotic, could be dysbiotic. Is that the word they usually use? Yeah. But the point just being, right, that there's a melding of some sort. It's not a complete fusion, but there's a melding of some sort. And at that intersection, right, does the virus and its sort of ultimate horizon come to infuse the host in a particular way, right, such that it starts to exert an influence and get bound up with all other kinds of political dynamics. So that's the way that I've been thinking most recently about the kinds of issues that I talk about in this paper. And it's already 15 minutes after, so maybe I'll leave it there and see if anybody has any thoughts that they'd like to share.
And so if you're just joining for the first time this week, if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask. And I've got another one queued up if no one else is ready to step in yet. So my follow-up is if you could just maybe say a little more about Nagel's piece. So you talk about the ways that this classic piece is depotentiating the encounter between humans and bats. And you're just talking a little bit about dysbiosis and symbiotic potentiality. But could you just unravel a little bit more what Nagel is doing to depotentiate these encounters, and maybe even taking the pathogens out of the story for a second, or taking the microbes out of the story? What kinds of potential possibilities do you see in these kinds of multi-species ethics that you're working towards?
So it seems to me that when the focus is largely or even exclusively on consciousness, what's missed is all of the processes through which every sort of conscious thought, perception, feeling comes into being. As I think about them, these are compositions, and they include activities not only within the individual subjective body, if you will. I wouldn't really put it that way, but also, right, exchanges that are going on continuously inside and outside of bodies, located in a particular place. And so an encounter is doing stuff on these other registers as well, and not just, right, it's not just something that a conscious subject perceives and experiences. And so what's interesting to me is the potential for these kinds of encounters to transform habitual ways of thinking, perceiving, and feeling. And you really have to have a focus on the non-conscious aspects of experience if you're going to think about that potentiality, right? Because you have to think about perception as being a function also of habits and not just sort of passive and simple. And so that I think is the major point of divergence.
Mm-hmm. I've got a lot more, but if anyone else wants to jump in, go for it.
Yeah, I have a question. What I enjoyed a lot in the article is that white nose syndrome leads us to think about a physiological function that we share with bats, which is sleeping, because it's not a disease that kills bats. It's a disease that prevents them from sleeping, and sleeping is what bats do a lot. And so that's an interesting contrast with Nagel, because Nagel talks about what bats have that we don't have, which is echolocation. Whereas bats do sleep, but they sleep in a very different way because they hibernate. And so I wanted to know how you chose white nose syndrome among all the diseases or among all the different functions of bats. Why specifically this fungus that affects sleeping?
The honest answer is because I read about it, because Elizabeth Colbert talks about it in The Sixth Extinction, and it just grabbed me for some reason. I'm not sure why. I was quite moved, actually, that before engaging Colbert's book, I think probably like many people, although this may not be as true anymore, I hope, sort of had a sort of gut level negative sense of bats, right, culturally, for probably obvious reasons. But then just reading her description in The Sixth Extinction, I began to feel differently about them. And then as I read more about them and learned more about them, I think probably in part also because of how how fast and how quickly white nose syndrome seemed to have swept across the North American continent. So I think I read earlier, I was doing some reading, Merlin Tuttle referred to it recently as the most serious wildlife disease epidemic in American history. So it seemed quite poignant. But I don't, yeah, it wasn't deliberate in any other way than those.
Just to follow the, I don't know if it's a metaphor, but if you think that bats spend so much time sleeping and it's part of their physiological specificity to repair their body constantly, the fact that a large part of the world is under lockdown and is almost asleep because of bats is worth thinking. But that's a derivation.
That's very interesting.
One of the
they're
things
sleeping, they're likely dreaming as well.
Go ahead, Lisette.
So it might be also interesting to think about how their dreams might be sustaining the earth in other ways. There's a really wonderful line, I think, in Ursula Le Guin's book of the one where she talks about time warps, like time transformations. I forget the name of the book, but she talks about how all of the yogis who are meditating are actually keeping earth in balance. And so it's interesting to think of that maybe perhaps in relation to the dreams of bats. How might those dreams of bats be doing work that we don't understand?
That's a fascinating fascinating question. Thank you for mentioning that about the dreams of bats. I mean, it's interesting. The first thing that comes to mind after your comment is just all of the other life forms that are implicated in bats' dreams, right? That sort of find expression in dreamlike ways. And that being another kind of network, that's right. That's maybe one way in which dreams are sustaining the world is through dreamlike expressions of relationship between bats and the other kinds of life forms that they come into contact with on a regular basis. That's really fascinating. Thanks.
One of the other moments in the essay that I was really interested in is when you're taking apart some of Masumi's arguments. You're sort of reading Masumi as saying the more differences, the better. And that sort of translates into a view of life broadly construed that grows more heterogeneous and more complex over time. So I'd love to just draw you out a little bit more and sort of have you situate your paper with respect to what Masumi's saying there.
So I think for most intents and purposes, I'm pretty close to Masumi, but on this point, one way to put the difference is that I am also inspired by a tragic tradition in which there are periodic catastrophes that are not necessarily traceable to any specific malfeasance. So I'm inclined to think that heterogeneities can be quite wonderful, but also that there's likely to be some incompatibilities, right? That just as things can proliferate and form new kinds of things, I don't see where, to me, it's hard for me to understand where the compatibility of all of the differences that come into being, where that would come from. And one, I think, important question is, well, what's the nature of these catastrophes or disruptions as I'm referring to them? Like at what scale and what kind of ramifications could they have? I don't know exactly what I think about that latter question, but you know, I think also one thing for me that's important is keeping some kind of perspective, by which I just mean actually I think what I mean is perspectivity. So from a process orientation, what the perspective is that of processes. But I mean, yes, I am a process and probably multiple processes, but I also experience myself as a subject, and I feel attached to other things and other subjects not really as processes, or not only as processes, but also as entities. And so I think to me, it's important to hold on to some notion of thingness, right? Which is where you feel this, the stakes of these incompatibilities. Incompatibilities matter for the things that they affect. So I want to hold on to a perspective that allows me to think about the value or not for things that, right, are sort of involved in these processes. That was a bit abstract, but does that come, is that, okay.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. I mean, there's so many rich ideas in this paper. You know, ecotone is another one. Is that your own neologism? Do you want to say more about that?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I was thinking of ecotones of experience as a way of thinking about the heterogeneity of experience, right? So different kinds of experience and different sites of experience within a body. And also how that experience sort of shades off like an ecotone would, right? You have these distinct but connected sites of activity. And through the connections, you get new kinds of emergences. And it's because of the heterogeneities that, right, this rich biodiversity comes into being. And so I was interested in thinking of it as a way of, a way to get away from the sort of sharp delimitation between self and other, or self and world. To think more in terms of grades, right, where things shade off into each other as opposed to being strictly separated from one another. And I like the idea too, because it's, I don't know, when I envision gradient, like a gradient, I can see how, right, certain things can find their way in, but only sort of make it to a certain, like they don't maybe don't make it all the way in, right, but they still make it part way in. So it's my way of trying to envision what an experiencing self looks like vis-a-vis the not self that's not so sharply opposed to it, but sort of works its way into it to some degree.
Thanks. Jane, it looks like you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say that I'm a bit of an Stephanie invited me and sent me the Zoom, so I hope it's okay if I just join in, even though I'm not part of your group.
Yes, welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on Eben, your question to Stephanie about Masumi and the differences. And Stephanie responded by talking about a kind of tragic perspective that isn't really accented in Masumi's work. And so I just wanted to see what you thought, Stephanie, about this. After I read your critique, it's not, critique is too strong, but your differentiation between your own views and that of Masumi. After I read that, I started to think more about what he's trying to do. And I wanted to see what you thought about this. It seems to me that, although in some of his books, he's more explicitly about a political project, a political economy project and capitalism, but other places, he seems to want to be accenting our participation in a cosmic realm of goings-ons, where the category of a tragedy doesn't really even apply, because as you said, it's only sort of as individuated bodies that word makes sense. So I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about whether you think it's a valuable political project to get people to acknowledge the extent to which they are like little motes of stardust or whatever, you know, that they participate in their daily lives. There's a register of experience that is, let us say, pre-individual, trans-individual, and non-individual, and whether that is something that's good to have, that sense is good to have as a kind of ethical being, or maybe as a spiritual being, but not necessarily as a political being? Or do you think that insight also is politically valuable, because in your response to Eben, you maybe set up a distinction between a kind of cosmic perspective on the one hand and then a political perspective on the other. So just if you could say a bit more about that.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. I do think it can be valuable. I'm not sure in all cases, but for one thing, I mean, the sort of, to me, it seems to bring with it a kind of a sense of participating in a legacy that's huge. And so not quite, you know, belonging, but a sense of being a part of something that's really quite extraordinary. So, and sort of having real connections to other things that are also part of that extremely capacious, wondrous thing. And so I also think that it can induce a sense of modesty, which is often good. But I also think that it's not, I think that there are other, at least for me, I can't, of course I can't speak for other people, but there are other experiences that I have in day-to-day life which contradict that one, right? Which make me feel not connected to everything and all other times, but right here, right now, and sometimes all alone. And so politically, I think it's important to be able to work back and forth between them is maybe what I'm saying. And also because I think for a sense of responsibility to the future and a sense of urgency to address real problems in the here and the now, that first register is not as good maybe at spurring action in response to concerns about the future and to real sort of gaping problems in the present. It may sort of cultivate a sense of, well, you know, I'm so little, I can't do too much. Things are sort of rolling along. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, although I wonder whether the model of action that you're thinking about there is maybe, I don't know, maybe too narrow, because it's about direct, it's privileging direct responsiveness as opposed to some other kind of more unexact, vague responsiveness, which may be powerful. But you and I have had a similar conversation about that.
That's true.
Well, I wonder what would happen if you bring it back to the bats and the fungus, like these specific questions. Like what can you do a little bit more of that translational work to take some of these abstractions and bring them into the realm of kind of the encounter that does something different?
That's a great question. I'm going to try to stall for as long as I can so I can figure out the answer. I mean, so I was reading Stefan's wonderful articles or blog posts over the weekend on viruses as processes, and on the you know, the sort of constellation of microbial life forms that seem to be quite implicated with, not right, like accessories to. I'm just thinking of humans in this case. I'll return to bats in a second, but in a way, it makes sense, I think. To understand this sort of swarm, this heterogeneous swarm, right, that is often referred to as a human being, as operating in some sense, right, all the sort of differentiated parts, operating with some sense of awareness of the others, right, in relation to which it is acting, sensing, feeling. I'm not saying it's a conscious understanding or conscious awareness that I am this and that is that and we are different and I should be aware of, right, of the bacteria. If I'm a virus, I should be aware of the bacteria. But there does seem to be likely some sensing of difference. I mean, I'm not sure that the question of whether sort of fully processed view versus a view of processes with some things. And maybe this brings me close to Masumi here, but I'm not sure the relevance of that from the perspective of bats and viruses themselves, right, as actors in the world. For how we think about bats and viruses, I can see the important difference. Because, right, we understand them not as being fully discrete entities. I don't know where I viruses. Oh, because of the piece I read, but bats and fungi, right? Not only as discrete entities and not only as mortal enemies. I just read a piece that is explaining that there has been some recovery in certain bat caves in upstate New York. So it's 8 or 9 years after the virus first appeared. The bats populations in these areas seem to be growing again. And so maybe actually this comes to your emergent ecologies book, Evan, in which, right, these sort of what I'm calling unusual encounters in this piece, they're not only vectors of death, I don't know, but right, they may also now lead to new kinds of life forms or new kinds of communities to grow up in their wake. So I think a view of processes, right, helps us to better see the multiplicity of potential outcomes, or you know, potential and real and virtual outcomes, in a way that makes probably planning more confusing. You know, sort of conservation planning, it adds more questions to the mix and less certainty, but may be important for holding on to a sense of possibility right now.
Does anyone else want to jump in? I've got a lot more. Jane, do you want to come back?
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
Evan?
please.
Hi, Stephanie. It's so nice to learn about your work. I hadn't read it before. I am part of this group occasionally when I'm able to come in, and luckily today was one of those days where I'm able to participate. And I just wanted to share with you, so I'm in love with a species that is also much maligned by the public health discourse in a similar way to bats. I really love raccoons. And, you know, what raccoons and bats share is that they're both labeled rabies vector species. So I'm particularly interested in rabies and the way that that plays out in these multi-species entanglements. And I've said this in the same forum before, but I feel like what's so interesting about this coronavirus outbreak, and obviously bats have been playing, you know, a huge narrative in the way that coronavirus is being understood. And that's been touched on a lot in this group as well. But at the same time, you know, I keep on going back to Deborah Bird Rose, and she has this beautiful article. I don't know if you've seen it, on flying foxkin.
We're reading that in the new year in the group.
Oh,
so.
Excellent. And what's beautiful about Deborah Bird Rose is, you know, she always privileges Indigenous storytelling, and that's why I can't help but think of, you know, beyond the scientific language, right? I really like to bring in the metaphorical, and just like other ways of knowing. And I think that this was also what I believe it was Jane was saying, you know, like, I think that we have to, you know, really play with the way that we tell stories and make it playful. But for me, one of the things that is so interesting about rabies as well, right, and about this, you know, these diseases that are so scary to humans, right, and about the public health discourse, which is what I'm often struggling with, is that we tend to lose sight of the kinship, right? We tend to lose sight of the fact that the reason that these species, like bats, like raccoons, the reason that they're vectors is because they're so similar to us, right? And that they're warm-blooded and they're vulnerable to these diseases. And therefore, obviously, you know, we're also vulnerable because we're entangled with them. And so, I mean, that's really the only commentary I wanted to say, is that I really think that Deborah Bird Rose would be lovely for you to encounter. I'm sure that you've probably heard her before, but that particular storytelling that she has in the Flying Foxkin. And then I also wanted to share some hope, which is I recently read that at UC Santa Cruz and the University of Oregon, they just came up with a way to counter the white nose syndrome. And so that is extremely, you know, thankful. I feel very thankful to those scientists, as much as I'm always like in a kind of like a tension with science and with, you know, with like the public health sector and the way that it, tends to pathologize these critters that I care about. At the same time, it's so nice to hear that there's hope on the horizon, right? So.
Thank you. And I think your first point is really important because, and about storytelling, because so often it seems to me, I'm a political theorist, so I don't perhaps know this stuff as well, but the response to the needed response, right? The response that happens with creatures such as bats is sometimes to talk about the services that they provide, right? To talk about the benefits that they make possible. But that, it does speak, of course, to tell stories in between this sort of right menace is economic in character. I don't want to say necessarily spiritual, but something in between those kinds of relations. And I think that's a really important point. Thank you, and thanks for mentioning about the white nose. I had read something about probiotics. Maybe that's the same thing that you're referring to, that they did at Santa Cruz and University.
Caitlin, do you want to jump in with your question?
Well, it wasn't actually so much a question. It was more a kind of, playful response to Jane's question about whether viral agency includes a sense of the tragic. So my comment in the chat was just that, this thinking, or Glissant talks about how, which has been on my mind lately, about thinking about myth and the function of myth in society, relating to filiation and genealogies of the social, and how that becomes broken apart. And I really feel that, the way that the lateral replication of viruses undermine patriarchal kind of patterns of filiation, and therefore also the mythic. So also possibly as well tragedy. It's just something that came up in response to Jane's prompt, and that also thinking about the minor forms of that Tsigan Nagai contrasts with in her book Ugly Feelings. That's exactly where the viral always felt like it had held for me its greatest forms of power. Were in these kind of minor irritation zones. And so those are just my comments, but I do actually have a little bit of a question comment for Stephanie about maybe also that sort of kind of irritated zone, in that also what I really appreciate was in this piece was setting up difference as something a lot more nuanced and moving. And I read for myself, I read also a lot of concerns around difference that come out of intersectional feminism, and that, beyond bats and multi-species as well, that's also something that we have to negotiate among human communities, is constantly, are you hearing me? What is it that you're projecting, negotiating? And where is this difference? Where is this, a shared communication? Am I hearing you right? Those kinds of understandings of self and other that we are always having to negotiate in the political realm. So I was just wondering, maybe if you could comment a little bit on that, which I kind of saw as a necessary political acknowledgement of the existence of difference, but not insurmountable difference, as a political framework.
Absolutely, yeah, thanks. That's a lovely question. When you were speaking, it occurred to me like the kinds of sort of continuous, not monitoring, but checking in, right? The sort of, is that what you're saying? Am I hearing you right? Do we mean the same thing by this term? That could, I don't see why that can't also translate into a multi-species practice as well. Of course, it would look very different. But just the way you described it, you know, this is a sort of model for encountering and negotiating with differences. It wouldn't be quite, you know, dialogical in the same way, but it you know, there is a sense in which that kind of process also is going to be more sensitive to changes that have transpired in the meantime, right? Sort of keeping a continuous eye not only on whether, like, how different things relate to one another, but also on what has transpired between them, right, might have affected them such that they have become something different since the questioning began. So I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but you know, the way you phrased it made me think of the applicability of what you described in a more than human context as well, and I think it's quite productive. So thanks.
We've got a bunch of questions stacking up. Angelica had her hand up a while ago. There's a number in the chat, and then Beyond, you also have your hand up, but Angelica first.
Hello.
Yep.
Hi, Stephanie, thank you very much for your talk and also your links. I also work with bats and people here in the Netherlands. Also connecting like on the multi-species approach. And I was wondering, because for me it's very difficult to connect these two academic worlds, like the biology and the social science of the humanities. So how do you experience this crossover, this overlapping of the both fields?
Thank you for your question. It's difficult but exciting, I guess maybe is a way of putting it. It's so challenging, but also very productive. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential. The stuff that I think I get most excited about is rethinking what have traditionally been understood as sort of fully separate, like, you know, physiological processes, understanding, right, the ways in which they are not only material but also mental, right? So thinking about the sort of ethical and political dimensions of certain kinds of physiology and ecological process as well. It's not, it's always going to involve, as I think about it, a sort of speculative, well, maybe not always, but at least early on, it involves a speculative dimension. But perhaps I'm not responding to what is that roughly what you were getting at?
In part, yes, but for example, how do you connect these? For example, you said you were talking with some friends that they were biologists. So how do you incorporate like the biology part of the whole problem of the fungus, the white nose syndrome, and also these politics in your paper? I mean, how was the process? How did you combine both? I'm curious about it.
That's a great question. I think that the biology has always, to me, been a source of questions, right? To see what kinds of political or ethical questions I think are opened up by the biology that I read, especially when it's this kind of biology that's very attentive to, like, the sort of in the genre of sort of Lynn Margulis, right, that Donna Haraway works with so often. That's very attentive to relations as well. But I would say, I mean, I'm a political scientist, but I'm a political theorist, so I'm not a typical social scientist is maybe a way of responding. So philosophy is very important for me, and it's probably easier to work from a philosophy than from a more quantitatively oriented methodology.
Okay.
So Frederic, in the chat, you had a comment about Debbie Bird Rose's articles. Was that a question for today, or just saying that you do want to come back and read it in the new year with us? You're muted.
Yeah, it's actually part of the conversation, following up on the discussion with Lisette. So without anticipating too much on the reading that you're going to make of Deborah Boudreau's, I think it's interesting to put it in the discussion with Stephanie's article, because Deborah Boudreau's talks a lot about the face of the bat. So her way to encounter the bat is kind of Levinasian gaze at the face, and so she talks about pollinization and the way the face of the bat is yellow with pollen, and so I wondered if Stephanie had thought about the very meaning of white nose syndrome in terms of how does it affect the face of the bat. I mean, a lot of the photographs we see of bats, particularly by Melvin Tuttle, show the variety of bats' faces. And so the fact that bat faces can be covered with yellow pollen or with white fungus, it also alters the way we look at their faces. It's just a thought, but I don't know if it's something that that Stephanie wanted to react upon.
And so I mean, I think there are several interesting questions that I can see come out of your question. Did you mean perhaps the appearance of the fungus, which in some of the photos I have seen can be quite overwhelming, right? It sort of takes over, not just the face, but the wings and other parts of the body as well. Did you mean like sort of inducing a sense of the grotesque, or of the danger, or just the coloration change or the textural change to?
Well, just for curiosity, I've seen some pictures of bats with white nose syndrome. It's actually not covering the nose, but the whole body. So I just wonder why they chose the term white nose syndrome. And so does it have to do with precisely this idea of the face and encountering the bat with the face?
That's a good question. I don't know, but I was just reading about it. Somebody explained it. It's called white nose syndrome because the fungus, right, shows up as white on the nose.
Mm-hmm.
So Kate, your question has provoked a lot of your question has provoked a lot of discussion already in the chat. Do you want to jump in?
So I was just thinking, what counts as kin in this sort of a situation? You know, who gets protected, who gets vilified, and why? You know, is it physical proximity? Is it because they're domesticated in our domestic sphere? Is it their appearance, their utility, the economic significance? You know, is it because of the mythologies or cosmologies where these animals fit into, you know, different systems of thinking? And so I've been trying to work through, you know, what counts, because I mean, raccoons are pretty cute. I mean, you could make a case. I mean, obviously lots of people think they're cute, you know, and bats in many ways are cute, as are rats and anything else. So what gets counted as kin in disease outbreaks when they affect us all? And for me, I keep going down to, of course, economic impact. You know, the economies of vaccination for both humans and domesticates is a big business. You know, is it because of how they fit into what we think in a, you know, typical Judeo-Christian tradition in the US? You know, those sorts of questions I'm trying to figure out, you know, why certain species count. Thanks.
I mean, I think in this case, the villain, at least as in the things that I've read, is the human. Because the idea is that this pathogen does not harm the bats. It was sort of maybe through coevolution. European bats are not vulnerable to this fungus in this way, and so it was, you know, thought to have been a species introduction that was responsible for the encounter. At least that's, I don't know if that's consensus view anymore, but it was at the time when I was reading about it. But your question reminds me of a special issue of, I think it was Australian Humanities Review on unloved others, which deals with this question in really beautiful, wonderful ways.
Can I just say something? Because I mean, just to follow up with Kate's question, I mean, I think that anthropo supremacy is who counts, right? I mean, that's like, and that's precisely where I'm coming from with my questions about rabies vector species, because the frustration I have working from the realm of wildlife rehabilitation is that if you become a wildlife rehabilitator, you have to place human life above those of the ones that you are actually engaging with, right? So if you want to be a wildlife rehabilitator for bats or for raccoons, which you're right, they are incredibly cute, and they are incredibly, like, part of the reason why they draw our attention so much is because we do find ourselves, similar too. And so going back to Frederick's question, I mean, I just found this quote looking for the Flying Fox Kin article, and she talks about them here. She says, with their small furry bodies and dog human-like faces, with their chattery camps full of individuals who are grooming each other and carrying on their daily life. It's like we do empathize with them because we do feel that mammalian similarity in many ways. But what's sad to me about the public health, positionality in relation to these species is that we have to place human life above theirs, right? There is no, like, if you become a wildlife rehabilitator, you must exterminate the animal who has had an exchange of affect with the unwittingly ignorant human who doesn't realize that if they think the raccoon is cute and they give it a kiss, that what they're doing is they're subjecting that animal to a beheading and ultimate death, right? And that is the public health perspective. There is no middle ground. You must exterminate. That's what happened with the minks. The minks may be having a transformation of the coronavirus. We must extinguish them. If it had happened amongst humans, and it is happening amongst humans, that the viruses are mutating, and they will mutate because that's what viruses will do to keep on transmitting, right? We're not going to go out and kill all the humans who have the mutated virus, at least not yet, right? This may happen in the future. We don't know. Or maybe it's happened in the past and I'm just ignorant of that particular case study. But, it is that anthroposupremacy that's marking the difference there, at least in the field that I know, which is this public health, wildlife rehabilitation field. And it's my frustration because there isn't it's not like they're willing to do a quarantine and just check to see if the animal develops the symptoms of rabies, for example. You have to put them down. So it's so fucked up.
So we've got 4 minutes left, and I'm going to propose a lightning round here. So Stefan, do you want to jump in with your anti-vaxxer comment?
Just very quickly, because the narrative of kinship and kind of gets hijacked by some people because they find the science literature on kind of viruses are part of us, like this science picture of they're very close and they work with the cells, and they use this to say, like the raccoons, you shouldn't shoot the virus. And obviously they use it for their own kind of, whatever their other motivations are, but it just gets very quickly hijacked also to goals which we might not agree with. So that's just a point.
And maybe to respond and sort of piggyback on that point, coming back to what you said, Stephanie, about emergent ecologies, I think, one of the things in the concluding gesture of that book that I was trying to do is insist that we think about the arbitrary and high stakes decision about deciding whom to love or what to love and how to care in multi-species worlds. And I think I'm definitely joining you here and pushing back against like this celebration of heterogeneity and difference, but that how to make that cut of who to care for. And this was very allied to Kate's point as well. It's in some ways arbitrary, and it's grounded in what Stingers calls reciprocal capture, like, what beings kind of hail you and enfold you in a relating. But beyond, you also had your hand up too.
Well, just very quickly, just thinking about these roles of similarity and difference in relation to what makes us care. That thought experiment about bats dreaming was wonderful. And I was kind of watching what was happening to me as I, thought through that. And I felt like, oh, do bats dream? What do their dreams look like? And how are they enacted at night? Just kind of brings me, like, the similarity brings me to the brink of that abyss of the unknown, but the unknown, the effort it takes is what actually makes me care a whole lot more than just like, oh, they're like me, fine, move on. But that like extreme effort is what actually bonds me more. Just wanted to share that.
And I think it's worth pausing on that for a moment, because another option that's available is not to think of it necessarily in terms of the human versus the other life form, but as an occasion to transform the way of being human, right? As an occasion to be human in a different way. And so I think those 2 points speak to each other quite nicely in that regard.
So thanks again, Stephanie, and everybody else. I see Stefan has to rush off. Oh, he's gone. I was going to ask him to do a pitch of his article for next week. So we've got kind of a Whitehead theme running through. Whitehead was in the piece today. We didn't really talk about Whitehead. Jakob mentioned Whitehead last week, but next week we're going to turn more explicitly to process philosophy. So Stefan's got a piece about virus as living process, a blog post reflecting his latest thinking, building on the piece he already published with John Dupre that we discussed early in the pandemic. And I think, Rachel, we settled on, is it 9 a.m. Central European time? So that probably is going to be too early for most people in the US, but if you find yourself awake at an odd hour, feel free to join us next week too, but definitely a time for folks in Europe and Australia to join next week. So great to have this fabulous piece, so generative. I mean, I feel like we've only talked about half of all the rich ideas in here, and I can't wait to see the book. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Bye.
And great to meet